They can actually transfer a depressive phenotype from a human depressed patient into a mouse, into a rat, and then this animal exhibits depression-like behaviors. Same with anxiety. Same with decreased social interactions, autism spectrum type model. So a whole range, all the way to schizophrenia.
I want to ask you about some practical measures people can take to improve the health of their gut. But before we get to that, Professor Mayer, I was hoping you could, for someone who's never ever thought about their gut and how it interacts with every other system in their body, just how important is your gut health? I know that might sound like a very simplistic question, but just can you give us a sense of exactly where, how big a rock is this in somebody's personal welfare?
I think for most people, it was not in their awareness, in their conscious awareness, that the gut is important beyond digestion and absorption and getting rid of the waste. That was sort of, even today, if you would do a survey, you would get this as the answer for most people. And associated with that opinion would be an image of the gut as a long tube that can contract and secrete and move things down, and that's obviously completely reductionistic and no longer appropriate to what we understand now. I'm not sure if how many people are actually now aware, even though they talk about gut health, that are aware how complicated that system really is, and that, for example, 70% of our immune system are based in the gut. A large part of our hormonal or endocrine system is based in the gut. A large part of our nervous system, 150 million neurons, are located in the gut, and they all talk to each other. So this idea of having a mechanical device tube inside of us is totally obsolete and no longer appropriate. So the gut health really refers now in scientific terms that all these systems are in balance and interact properly with each other and are not perturbed, for example, by these chronic stresses.
I've seen the gut and the digestive system described as almost the second brain. It's that influential. Is that something you would go along with, or is that just not a nice soundbite that people are using?
It's a soundbite in some ways. I mean, there's definitely a lot of science behind it. We have, as I said, 150 million nerve cells, same size as the spinal cord, sandwiched between the muscle layers of our gut. So imagine you have a brain that's flattened out, like you take your big brain, you flatten it out, you wrap it around the gut, and then you put another layer on it. So it's a pretty amazing system. The main function of that system virtually every animal has that system. It's not just humans. And the main function is to regulate all gut functions, from contractions, secretions, peristalsis, blood flow. And that system can work in isolation. You can take the gut of a mouse and take it out and put it in an organ bath, and it will still do the same things. It will still do the peristalsis so it doesn't really need the help of the brain. But the way in the intact organism it works, the brain knows, our big brain knows everything that goes on in this little brain in our gut, and it lets it function as long as nothing bad happens. If there's any serious stress happening, like a gastrointestinal infection, a bad bacteria, an injury, then the big brain comes in and helps out, and with its own emergency measures. So second brain, it's from an evolutionary term, the gut brain was actually first, like hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then gradually, our big brain developed based on many of the neurotransmitters that the gut brain has. So in evolutionary terms, the gut brain was the first brain, and then our big brain came. Now, when we look at it, it's the second brain, second in relevance and importance, and in the hierarchy of, homeostatic regulation.
How much do we know about the gut and how it works? As someone who's been at the forefront and a pioneer in this research, how much has our knowledge base expanded over the past few decades? Is my first question. Like, where are we in the grand sense of how well we understand the system? And then as a follow-up, Professor, what are you most excited by in terms of the medical and the research breakthroughs that are coming down the track?
Yes, I mean, that's a whole talk in itself. So when I was in my early part of my career, there were some pioneers studying the gut brain, the enteric nervous system, the second brain, and did a phenomenal job, from zero knowledge all the way today that you can computer simulate. We know all the circuits, all the transmitters. In terms of our gut brain, we pretty much know almost all its functions, and we know what kind of nerve cells regulate what, and we also know how it interacts with the immune system and the hormonal system. So we know a lot. In terms of practical applications, that has, as it often does, it's somewhat lagged behind, because the symptoms of gut health, like irritable bowel syndrome, are more in this interaction with the brain rather than just the gut health. There's a few disorders like this rare diseases, genetic or acquired, of degeneration of this gut brain. And then people develop very serious complications that the gut no longer contracts. And, sometimes people can no longer eat regularly. And, but it's not sort of revolutionized medicine in some ways. I think the modern concept of gut health and this brain gut microbiome interaction, that has, we're still early in studying this. Some spectacular results about 10 years ago in mice, in laboratory mice, and in some animals. The translation of these findings into humans, that, for example, many of the chronic mental disorders could be explained by this dysregulation. We haven't really reached a final answer in humans, and we don't have actionable strategy, for example, to treat Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or autism spectrum. I think we're moving closer to that point where there will be dramatic opportunities, but we may be 10 years away from that,
But sorry to jump in, but you feel like we are on the right track. We are. This is. When you mentioned Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, we know there is a link there. We're confident that if we can continue on the path, we are going to find some answers. It's not as though we're barking up the wrong tree, for instance.
No. I think it's not going to be the only thing. There's sort of a new understanding of the body and biology, which is systems biology, that to understand health and disease, you have to look at the whole system, almost like a scientific version of the old-fashioned, holistic theories of everything. So now we have actually pretty good evidence. This brain-gut microbiome system, in my opinion, will certainly continue to have a prominent role in explaining these really intractable chronic diseases that we're dealing with. If there's other components that will come up from other parts of science, from genetics, from immunology, that sort of make that whole understanding even more complex, and that's quite likely. I mean, science is moving at such fast pace. Immunology, for example, what we know today in 10 years will be probably partly obsolete. neuroscience the same way, and microbiome science as well. So we're in an exponential growth phase of all the sciences that deal with this brain gut microbiome system and ultimately gut health. And I think we will refine the picture, and we will ultimately, I convinced in the next 10 years, we'll have breakthroughs in some of these disorders, particularly Parkinson's, autism spectrum, and Alzheimer's, that will involve in some way or another the gut health concept.
You've mentioned, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's there, and autism spectrum disorder. Are there any other kind of diseases or conditions where you've been surprised by the unexpected impact that the microbiome has had?
Yeah, from animals, we know it from, depression. So the very good models of depression, that you can actually transfer a depressive phenotype from a human depressed patient into a mouse, into a rat, and then this animal exhibits depression-like behaviors. Same with anxiety. Same with decreased social interactions, autism spectrum type model. So a whole range, all the way to schizophrenia. So there was initially, when these mouse studies came out, people got, in my opinion, overly enthusiastic that all our diseases are brain gut microbiome disorders. I don't believe that. I think that a few of them will come out as really the main ones, and in the other ones, the microbiome might play a sort of a smaller role. But one thing we should emphasize: it's just very difficult to study this in humans. In the mouse models, you're studying genetically identical animals that are raised in identical conditions, fed the identical food, so you can control everything. You can get findings in as few as 10, 20 mice that are statistically significant. In humans, none of these conditions is actually applies. We're all genetically different. Microbiome, only we have similarities with our neighbor. 10%, we share only about 10% of the microbial strains with our neighbors and friends and family members. So it's much more challenging to prove this in humans. And I would think that the main challenge in this field is the animal studies keep coming out, and they're fantastic, but I think the main challenge is to really show in which subset of patients does this make a difference, or are there genetic or microbial subsets of patients where this is really the main cause, and then target treatments at these subsets. So if everybody has a slightly different combination of how these systems interact, a generalized therapy probably won't do the job, with the exception of, I would say, these lifestyle measures, because the lifestyle measures affect the whole system, not an individual target.
You mentioned there in terms of the microbiome's impact on mental health. What about physical health? What do we know about the link between someone's gut microbiome and prevalence of obesity, for instance? Do we have any understanding or information on how an individual's gut could make them more likely to gain weight, or on the flip side, more likely to stay lean?
Yeah, there's lots of studies in terms of metabolism and the important role of certain, because we're dealing with this epidemic of obesity and metabolic syndrome, and clearly it's been identified that the gut microbiome, the composition and the function is different if you compare a population that's obese or has type 2 diabetes, as opposed to one that's fit and lean. These epidemiological differences, group comparisons, there's absolutely no question that it's altered. And yeah, it goes beyond that, because we now know that, for example, certain microbes play a major role in our satiety mechanisms. They signal some of the molecules that they produce. They signal to cells in our gut they contain these satiety hormones, like GLP-1 that's now becoming quite popular in terms of a medication for obesity. So the microbes have ways to regulate the release the release of that hormone, and so certainly there is a very important part of it, and the way we nurture an unhealthy microbiome that is more inflammatory or less anti-inflammatory plays a big role. So inflammation or gut-based immune activation always plays a big role in most diseases, really, where we think it's involved. So both the mental disorders, but also in obesity, metabolic syndrome. Virtually, it goes all the way to colon cancer, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Take any of the chronic illnesses that we're dealing with today in our society. This chronic inflammation always plays a role as an important factor. And the microbes play a major role in regulating the immune activation in our gut. So in some ways, if you ask me what's the most convincing argument to emphasize the importance of the microbiome is its interaction with the gut-based immune system, which then generalizes throughout the body and affects all our diseases. And the interactions is bidirectional. So, for example, physical exercise, moderate, regular physical exercise has been shown to have a beneficial effect on microbial function and composition. Extreme exercise, like extreme athletes, like triathlon and ultramarathons, has the opposite effect on gut health and the microbes. So it's like this microbial system is amenable to these these body functions like exercise, but can also influence, for example, endurance. If you have certain spin joints, if you have certain microbes, they can convert lactic acid that becomes available with physical exercise into short chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory. If you have this group of microbes, then obviously you have a physical advantage of your microbiome. And there's studies going on now with what's called second generation probiotics that will give you these, if you don't have them, naturally, can give you some of these microbes that help you break down lactic acid into fuel and anti-inflammatory substances.